obviously this week it was the launch of the Steam Deck OLED, and there was the predictable rush to the Steam store to basically crash the site and get hold of this hot new hardware. But in the meantime, basically across the whole week, people have been asking me one question. I'm getting DMs about it. I'm getting,
Yep.
it's the question. I guess it's because the Asus ROG Ally has basically had £100 shaved off its retail price for Black Friday. And the question is, should I get a ROG Ally or should I get the Steam Deck OLED? And yeah, two different devices that do two very different things, but there is a great deal of crossover, and I guess they are comparable. I'm going to start by talking about benchmarks here because I benchmarked 4 games between the Steam Deck LCD and the OLED model for my Steam Deck review. So I basically rebenched those games on the ROG Ally, and I benched them at the 15-watt performance mode and the 25-watt turbo mode. It should be stated that battery life at 15 watts is significantly worse than the Steam Deck and significantly worse still than the OLED, whereas 25 watts, which is where you get the a lot more performance. Basically your battery life takes an even further bigger hit. But let's talk about the games. So we're going to kick off with Forza Horizon 5 here. This one's going first because it kind of represents our best case scenario for the Ally up against Steam Deck, at least in the 4 benchmark games I've got here for you. Really interesting results here at native 720p, high settings, 4x MSAA, and long motion blur shutter speed, which is the way I like it. So in the Ally's 15-watt performance mode, there's 36% boost up against the Deck OLED, pretty substantial. And that increases up to 69% in the 25-watt turbo mode. So bearing in mind the power and architectural improvements of the Z1 Extreme up against Van Gogh in the Deck, kind of what I'd expect, really. Pretty happy with these results. Good stuff. You can see occasionally here that the Deck OLED definitely has less stutter than the Deck LCD, and it runs a bit faster overall, but still I'd call this a strong start for the Ally. But things kind of switch up as we look at the other games, right? And we're in A Plague Tale Requiem now, and some pretty sobering results on this one. So Deck OLED, nice 8.3% boost up against Deck LCD, and that's actually enough to give it virtual parity with the ROG Ally's 15-watt performance mode. It's just 2.9% faster, which is just basically outside the sort of margin of error there. Turbo mode, 25 watts on the Ally, 34% boost to performance there over the Deck OLED. But this area in the game is pretty demanding on mobile chipsets. And that 34 percentage point boost actually translates to 53 FPS on average. So you're in a nice VRR window there. I'm not actually sure what frame rate cap you could give to the Deck with a 39 FPS average. Not quite at 40. I guess you'd have to drop down to 30. So that's an interesting example, actually, of how VRR sort of elevates the Ally to a different performance tier, really. Even so, you're still paying for that with a lot of extra battery power for that extra performance. At similar power levels, as you can see, the Ally gives you nothing much more, really. But let's move on. So couple more benchmarks here, and going to see some weird results, I guess, because, you'd expect the Ally just to be faster overall, generally, whatever the scenario. Marvel Spider-Man Deck OLED is beating Deck LCD by 7.4%, but in this part of the game, the intro sequence here, it also beats the Ally's performance mode by 7.8%, which is unexpected. Again, you need to give the Z1 Extreme a lot more juice to beat the Steam Deck. 25-watt handheld turbo mode, extra 29% of performance. So on the face of it, not a great look for the Ally, really. At 15 watts, you don't get much of a boost up against the Deck. In fact, you don't get anything. But once you go hell for leather with the power and to hell with battery life, I guess, then it's a game changer. And with the Ally, you're not beholden to frame rate caps, really, with that VRR screen. That extra 29% of performance, once again, works really nicely with a VRR screen, which is something you don't have on Steam Deck, of course. Let's round off with a final benchmark, Cyberpunk 2077, and it's our in-city streaming run. I actually got weirdly conflicting results with the official benchmark on the Ally. If I ran it before the streaming test, it would be much, much faster than the deck. But if I ran it after the streaming test, it would be, a bit slower, which is odd. So I stuck with the streaming test, right? Consistent results each run. And it's a better workout for the CPU and GPU anyway, really. Another example of the deck running better than the Ally at 15 watts here, surprisingly, with the deck OLED offering extra 17 percentage point lead over the Ally. And even the LCD model, 8% faster than the Ally at 15 watts. But once again, give the Z1 Extreme extra juice, and we're really at the races. 32 percentage point lead for Ally over deck OLED. Yeah, weird one this. I guess I remember seeing some stories about Cyberpunk on Linux running faster than Windows, and there were some outlandishly high figures there. And this may well be the kind of mobile iteration of that. There are several examples I think we've seen where the Linux driver is actually just more efficient than the Windows one in some scenarios, which sounds kind of nuts, but it is true, and certainly looks like what's happening here. Interesting stuff, though. So, overall, looking at these benchmarks, as I bring this monologue to an end, bottom line is that VRR plus that extra performance can really work for the Ally, right? But at the same time, it's pretty rare for the specs of the Z1 Extreme to make themselves known to the extent that you'd really want. And yeah, I guess that's the end of the commentary on the benchmarks here. But obviously, there's a lot more to the package than just the performance numbers alone. Although obviously, that is going to be a major attraction for the ROG Ally there. Yeah, so that's kind of the way the ROG faces up against the deck in terms of performance. Screen-wise, obviously, you guys haven't seen it, but OLED is always going to beat an LCD. But VRR is something which opens up a lot of possibilities for the ROG Ally. John, what do you make of all that massive information dump I just gave?
Well, it just makes me still want to go for the Steam Deck OLED mainly because I look at something like the ROG Ally and it's a nice product. I've held one, but because it's it's like a normal PC style experience. Which can be a positive, but at that point, I'd almost just rather get a small laptop that's a little more capable versus the Steam Deck, which I think the Steam Deck seems to occupy this space where it bridges the gap between PC and console, delivering an almost console-like experience, but with some of the additional freedom you get with the PC. So when gauging the two products, for me, it's not really just about the performance, right? Like, yeah, you can get some better performance on the ROG Ally, but it's still not the same kind of experienciness I would necessarily want as a portable device. Plus, there's the battery life considerations as well to consider. So, if I were making the choice right now, I would definitely still select the Steam Deck OLED over it. Now, before I might have thought a little bit differently about it because the original Steam Deck LCD is so bad. And
yes,
the ROG Ally, of course, the one big benefit it does have, and I have to admit this is a huge one, it's VRR. And this is something Steam Deck cannot do. And for a portable device with limited amount of, capabilities, you can expect some frame rate instability depending on your settings, and that would essentially act as the cushion for it.
Yeah.
Whereas on Steam Deck, you really got to optimize the game to make sure that you're getting at least a pretty locked experience, which could mean more sacrifices, especially on the less capable hardware. But, they have the frame rate cap features in there that work pretty well, I would say. So
yeah, I think I see them as two quite different devices that are occupying a similar space.
That's right.
The thing I'd like to point out is that obviously there's going to be games that you can run on the ROG Ally because it runs on Windows that you can't on the Steam Deck because for various reasons they've been locked out of Linux. It's quite tricky to get games that aren't in Steam. For example, Alan Wake 2 running on the Steam Deck. And of course, there's the fact that, that extra performance generally gives you enough extra leeway in order to actually get a game like Alan Wake 2 working on the ROG Ally, whereas I suspect it would be extremely challenging to do the same on the Steam Deck.
That also raises the point about what type of games you actually want to play on these devices.
Absolutely.
And I feel like something like Alan Wake 2 is exactly the type of game I would not ever care about playing on a portable system. It's not meant for that. Like the way that game is designed, it just doesn't seem to work well. I feel like you're sacrificing too much to enjoy it, right? And least of all, the hardware requirements, but it's also about just where you would use a portable device, right? Like you kind of kill the atmosphere of a game like that, and it's a slower paced game.
Slower pace.
So you know, there's a lot of these high end AAA games that you look at running on these portable systems. Like it's neat that they can do it, but they're not always that well suited to portable play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Any impressions from you, Alex?
Not really. I just kind of want to stress what I said the week before is that, you know, I when you start getting into the higher end territory of these devices, I do wonder if a laptop is actually maybe your better suited thing, at which point then the range that you could scale above something like the ROG Ally, actually, it just goes up quite a lot as you see, as you advance up to a laptop, even for the lower end kit. So, yeah, that's kind of what I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good point because, you know, when I was doing that RTX 2050 testing for the Switch 2 SoC examination, the 2050 with like massively cut back clocks was basically in ROG Ally territory, right? So that's the 2050. If you move down, you know, towards today's 4050 or 4060, more efficient, more features, more performance, and it's going to completely annihilate what you can do on these handhelds. The difference being, of course, it's not a handheld.
Right.
I'll be interested to see what kind of battery life you can actually get from those 4050 and 4060 laptops as well. I'd really like to take a look at that, actually, come to think of it. But yeah, I guess we should move on to some supporter questions on this topic. This one from Admiral Spudman. I have a problem with Valve's quote unquote that technology doesn't exist yet as for why they haven't updated the APU in the Steam Deck. The current APU is Zen 2 CPU cores. Zen 3 was a big jump in performance for AMD. Why not at least update the CPU cores? Obviously it's not that simple, but in theory it would have been a big boost. So we did I did take a look at the 6800U, which I believe used, I think that was Zen 3, maybe it was Zen 2. But what we're generally finding is there's a lot of stuff going on within these APUs that limit performance. You know, the power budget for one, and the fact that you're mostly GPU limited in most scenarios. And the CPU doesn't seem to be having a gigantic impact on performance. Maybe if you're sort of going to be paring back the GPU features substantially in order to move the CPU to the fore, I'm not seeing this kind of big jump in performance from the newer architecture, but also the fact it's got double the amount of cores. Now, there's nothing game-changing in there. This question from B Spoke, Valve's Pierre Loup has stated a few times that he feels a 15-watt TDP cap is the max a handheld should ever have. This, of course, leads to a design that favours better low TDP performance and good battery life. What's your take on this philosophy? Well, I think his philosophy is actually bang on the money, right? Because, you know, I just showed you the benchmarks from a chip that's running at 25 watts that has 50% more compute units running on a newer architecture that has double the amount of CPU cores running on a newer architecture. We should be seeing game-changing performance, but we're not, right? And this kind of ties in exactly with what they're saying about the technology not existing yet for a Steam Deck 2. Maybe when we reach the point where Steam OS will be running properly and Valve certified on these Windows devices, we'll get to see a better picture of efficiency of these AMD APUs. But I think it's the fact that Valve specifically targeted a limited hardware configuration for the deck to actually get the best balance of performance versus silicon. I think they did a really good job there. And you look at the Steam OLED and it's pretty fantastic overall. I guess we should try and sum this up. And I think ultimately the ROG Ally is great if you have no real concerns about battery life. I mean, Oliver loves his, and he has a big bunch of rechargeable batteries that he adds into the USB-C port to get, better battery life. But yeah, and it has that VRR screen, which is really, really useful. It solves a lot of your problems when you're thinking about how to target, performance versus the capabilities of the silicon. But the Steam Deck OLED basically solves so many of the issues of the original model. The battery life is better, significantly better, and it's already class leading. The screen is on another level compared to any handheld device I've ever seen. I think right now, just, for a mainstream PC user who wants a handheld PC, there's only really one choice, and that is the Steam Deck OLED, because it takes care of so much for you. If you're an enthusiast that wants performance, that wants the VRR screen, that is okay to occasionally, slot in a USB hub into your handheld in order to set things up, the ROG Ally is also a great device. Maybe there's some more content we could do on that in due course, but I think that's my take on it now. I think that's pretty reasonable.